Well, my background is I've been a journalist for about 20 years. I used to be the editor of the Texas Observer, which is a political magazine in Texas. Molly Ivins was my boss. Anybody know who Molly Ivins is? And then I worked for, then I wrote a book about a police corruption scandal in the Panhandle. It's called Tulia. And then I worked for Texas Monthly for about 10 years. And along the way, I became very interested in wolves. And then the genesis of this book was a wolf watching trip that I took to Yellowstone in 2007, just before my kids were born. Last sort of non-responsible sort of thing to do. I mean, not literally right before my kids were born, you understand. During the months before my kids were born. And saw wolves there for the first time, thanks to this gentleman here, who I hope has already told you, if you don't know already, that this is the person who ran the Wolf Reintroduction Project in Yellowstone. We've covered that already.
It wouldn't have mattered otherwise.
Okay. Saw wolves there for the first time, met Rick McIntyre, who's the park's wolf guru. I don't know how many people here are familiar with Rick McIntyre. He is, louder please?
Yeah, the mic needs to go up.
I agree.
Por favor.
You've waited long enough. Deserves to hear. So I met Rick. Rick is a true eccentric. He's in his mid-60s. He has never been married. He is probably the person who has personally observed more wolves in his lifetime than any other person on the earth. He's famously obsessed with wolves. He works for the Park Service. He's sort of the wolf interpreter when the wolf watchers come to the park. He famously never missed a day in the park for 15 years. Every day his schedule was the same. Get up before dawn, follow the wolves in the park with their tracking collars, get them in his scope, and watch them all day long. And watch them all day long. But you realize it's practically in my mouth now. If you can hear it better, I'll do it. And watch them all day long. And he's the kind of guy, if you're a magazine journalist, he just screams, please write a profile about me. And I asked him if he was interested in participating in a magazine piece, and he said yes. And then I didn't call him for 10 years. And when I did call him, it wasn't for a magazine piece, it was for a book. And the book, as Mike may have told you, is about the wolf who became the most famous wolf in Yellowstone, arguably the most famous wild animal in the world. She was nicknamed the 06 female. They called her that. That was her nickname for the year in which she was born. She wasn't the first famous wolf in Yellowstone, but she sort of came of age during the time that Facebook and other social media were really exploding, and so she was the first sort of social media phenomenon in the park. And so when I heard her story, I figured that was the way in to tell Rick's story and the story of the wolves and the story of this enormous political fight that has been going on in the West for decades and will soon be coming to your state if Mike Phillips has anything to say about it, which was also fascinating to me because it's a story about what the West is, what the West means to us in this conflicting set of values, this cultural clash that's going on in the West and has been for quite some time. That was a long answer to the first question.
So here's what I'd like Nate to do. I've read his book, I've studied it, I strongly recommend that you at least read it. You may not have studied it the way I did, but nonetheless. I would like Nate to read what I found to be the most compelling paragraph in one sentence, because I think it says in just a few words. Nate's done a beautiful job encapsulating the essence of the book and why you should read it. It's a beautiful read, it's an easy read, and it's an important read. So I'm springing this on you, buddy, but they're your words, so they should seem familiar.
Tell me what page.
They're marked 234, marked with my pen. Let it rip.
Well, this is the sad part.
No, but it's...
I object. But I would like to read.
Yeah, you pick your spot.
I do have a section.
I thought of that, but I thought, no, I'm going to put him on the spot.
I'm in no
my
position
spot.
to object being 30 minutes late, but I'm taking over the reading. Okay. All right, the book. What's different about this book is that it's not an essay. It is a book about wolves that is told from the perspective of the wolves themselves. The wolves are like characters in a novel. It's nonfiction. It reads like a novel. The only way that was possible is because of how famous 06 was, and because People like Rick were so obsessed that they took daily notes on O6 and her pack for 3 years. In fact, the first person to share them with me was a woman named Lori Lyman, a retired school teacher from San Diego. She heard I was working on this project. She said, "Oh, well, you will need this." And she gave me 2,400 pages, 3 years worth of daily observations of O6 on her pack. And it was a treasure trove. It was like the diary of a wolf. So I had that material, and I went to Rick and got his notes. And so if you're wondering how possibly these details could be known, that is the answer. Okay. This is from chapter 3. It's called A Star is Born. At this point in O6's story, she's been a lone wolf for a couple of years. She's left her natal pack. She's roaming around Yellowstone. She's trying to find a territory of her own, which is very difficult because they're all sort of occupied by other packs. And she's trying to find a mate of her own. She's trying to draw a young male out from an established pack to become her mate. The pack that she's sort of been haunting the edges of the territory is called the Druids. They controlled the Lamar Valley for the first decade of reintroduction. They're kind of like the Kennedy family of Yellowstone. We've had 3 documentaries made about them. They were by far the most powerful pack in the park, and they controlled the best territory. But by 2009, when this takes place, the Druids were somewhat in decline. They had lost their alpha male, and more crucially, they had mange had spread throughout the pack, which is usually not serious, but they had a very severe case. It was the dead of winter, and they were getting weaker and weaker. So that's when, that's sort of the scene is set. And the only characters you need to know are O6 and White Line, who is the alpha female of the Druids. Okay, here we go. I have reading glasses, but I'm not going to go back to the hotel for them.
At least don't take yellow cab.
Oh, that's Texas friendly. Okay.
Now those are bifocal. They're either reading or computer distance. Probably somewhere in there.
Okay. All right. It takes the O6 had been howling for days, and at last it had paid off. Atop a partially forested knoll on the western edge of Little America, she stood nose to nose with 2 young black wolves, a pair of roaming brothers who had only recently made a tentative stab at joining the ranks of the Druids. They were both yearlings, though one was noticeably larger, already over 100 pounds, with room on his lanky frame for more if he continued to eat well. The bigger brother had a salt and pepper muzzle and a white blaze on his breast shaped like a cross. He was acutely interested in O6, sniffing her as she stood still, tail held high, and allowed herself to be inspected. But it was the smaller of the brothers who was clearly in charge, and he was the one O6 wanted. This wolf's jaw was stippled with gray, as were his withers and chest, making him look older and more weathered than his brother, though in reality, neither had much experience being away from their natal pack. His eyes were a light tan color, almost yellow. As he stood motionless, transfixed by the female in front of him, the jilted brother approached his sibling at a crawl, first reaching up to lick at his chin, then turning on his back in the snow to gently paw at his face. He looked like an overgrown pup, which wasn't far from the truth. O6 laid her chin across the smaller brother's back. The 3 of them lingered there on the hilltop, under a cobalt blue sky, 3 interlopers far from home, and considered one another. O6 wandered down off the knoll to the west, and the brothers followed. White Line had been lingering just out of sight on the far end of the knoll with 2 of her sisters, oblivious to the encounter taking place nearby. Suddenly the Druids seemed to realize they could no longer smell the 2 males. They began trotting west to investigate. O6 was halfway up a neighboring ridge when the trio appeared far below, 3 black wolves in a line, scent trailing her and the 2 males. Hers was a smell they had become very familiar with, and they were never pleased to find it. Now she raced across the face of the ridge and down through the forested slopes on its far side, heading for a low spot in the Lamar River known as Buffalo Ford. The brothers followed hesitantly. Even in their weakened state, the Druids managed to close the distance, and for a moment, the brothers seemed torn between their new acquaintance and the pack they had recently adopted as their own. Eventually, the smaller black peeled off and headed back towards the Druid females. His brother chose instead to follow O6 as she headed south across the frozen river. The Druids had no real chance of catching O6, who almost seemed to be enjoying the chase. The running they had already done had cost the pursuers energy they couldn't afford to spend. Having recovered at least one of their males, The three sisters clustered, exhausted, in the lee of a basalt cliff. One of them collapsed in the snow, while White Line, whose mange was too severe to lie down on such an icy bed, stood over her, trying to nap standing up. 06 led her remaining prize up to the top of a prominent butte and then paused on an exposed ledge where the pair bedded down. She had chosen a spot with a commanding view of Little America, less than a mile from where her pursuers were resting. Why had she stopped? She had found a willing mate, albeit not perhaps her first choice, and she was on the far western edge of Druid territory. She had only to lead the male a bit farther away from her rivals, and she'd be home free, with the prospect of starting her own pack in a territory relatively unvisited by neighboring clans. Yet she lingered. She had been playing hide-and-seek with the Druids for weeks, gambling with her life on a daily basis for a chance to be near the two new males. She was an excellent hunter. What she needed was a piece of land where she didn't have to risk her life every time she went looking for a meal. Little America was good habitat, but most of it belonged to the Druids, and the Druids did not tolerate trespassers. At least, that had always been true in the past. In 2 months of chasing 06, this generation of Druids had never come close to catching her. She should have been dead by now, but here she was, not only alive, but the healthiest, most vital wolf for miles around. High on her perch, 06 seemed to be waiting for the smaller male, bedded far below with the miserable Druid females, to make a decision. She didn't howl, but it seemed she didn't need to. After a brief respite, the male stood up and wandered a short distance away from the resting females, his nose to the ground. He caught the scent he was looking for, and moments later, he was gone. The Druids, too exhausted to follow, howled helplessly. When the black reached his brother in 06, there were warm greetings all around, as if the three had been together for years. Shortly thereafter, as the Druids' unanswered howls echoed off Specimen Ridge, the trio set out together once again. 06 paused to urinate. Instead of squatting, she raised her leg to scent mark a tree, then scratched the earth nearby, lest her sign be missed somehow. It was the mark of an alpha female, and its message was unmistakable. This land is mine. The two males inspected her mark, then added their own on top. They were hers too.
See, that was better than what I thought. But when you buy the book, you'll see in the front, Nate has done us the great favor of presenting 06's lineage. And through her mother, her grandparents were the Druids. And through her mother, her great-grandparents were two of the most important wolves that started the program. Her great-grandfather was illegally killed, skinned, beheaded, at the time that her great-grandmother was pregnant with what would become her grandfather. And she whelped those puppies on the flanks of Mount Maurice. I could hear her radio signal as we were trying to figure this out, sitting in the hotel room of the Red Lodge, I'm sorry, the Super 8 in Red Lodge, Montana. I'd stick the antenna out the window with my headphones on, and I could hear number 9, who was 06's great-grandmother. I could hear the radio caller from the hotel. So Nate used the notion that these wolves are the Kennedys. Indeed, in many, many ways they are. But I want to ask Nate, and I make reference to page numbers, and I'm going to share them with you so you can sort of follow along if you're so inclined. He does a beautiful job getting us to the beginning and the middle and the end of the story, and speaks about radio collars on page 169, 204, and 205. And Nate, I'd like for you to explain to the folks that the knowledge that we have of 06's demise should never have been known. A mistake was made.
Yes, as Mike mentioned, once a year they do collaring. They try to have at least one collared wolf in every pack, or 2 in case something happens to the collared wolf, so that they can be followed and tracked and studied. When 06 rose to become the alpha female of her own pack, she eventually outwits and then outfights White Line. Those scenes are in the book too. There was the question, of course, arose, should she be collared? She was by that time by far the most favorite wolf of this subculture of diehard wolf aficionados, but she also had become quite celebrated more broadly. She had become something you could come to see when you come to Yellowstone, like Tower Falls or Old Faith. And so it was controversy. And the watchers, especially a filmmaker named Bob Landis, this is how I heard the story. Mike, you can correct me, they essentially imposed their will on the biologists that run the project and said, please, please don't call her this one wolf. She is too wild to wear the mark of any human endeavor. And Bob Landis said, besides, I've got 2 years of outstanding footage with no collar on, and if you put the collar on halfway through the movie, she'll have a collar and it will ruin it. And Doug Smith, who was the lead biologist and later succeeded Mike to become the director of the program, said, okay. However, one of 06, or more than one of 06's yearling females grew up to look exactly like her. And when the helicopter is coming in, they do have to dart the wolves. It tranquilizes them, doesn't harm them. They do have to dart them, and when the helicopter comes in, as you might guess, it gets a little chaotic. And the snow is blowing, wolves are running every which way. And in the years before 06 became so celebrated, Doug Smith had tried to dart her from the helicopter, but it couldn't be done. She was a very special wolf. She was extremely charismatic, but she was also very clever. Other wolves would just sort of run willy-nilly in a straight line, you know, with kind of heedless of cover, but she would go straight for the trees. Just too smart. And so I think when Doug got this gray wolf in his sights, he thought this can't be 06, and he pulled the trigger. And even when he got down there, he, unlike Rick McIntyre or Lloyd Lyman, he hadn't spent all day, every day watching 06. So he wasn't sure if he had the right wolf or not. And he looked at her, and she was in such outstanding shape. Her teeth were perfect, and her muscle tone was perfect. And he said, this is a yearling or a two-year-old. This is not a 4-year-old. And so he called her, and it wasn't until the next day that they realized.
Can't hear you.
It wasn't until the next day that they realized their mistake.
So I want to ask Nate, and I'm asking the audience, I'm assuming that Nate will share the stage with everybody that took valuable time to come and share the evening with us. Question to Nate and then to you, and we'll have to walk through you quickly, because you are many. Doug and I disagree on radio collars. Again, be mindful the gray wolf is one of the most studied large mammals in the world. And I say to Doug, how many more wolf kills do you have to inspect to realize, oh my gosh, that animal's predisposed to predation. It has arthritis in its hip, or it's malnourished. And I have suggested to Doug for years that he conduct a shadow study. A study that would be based on direct observations without any reference to telemetric monitoring. And if you ask how that can be done, well, gee whiz, do you know, for decades, beautiful work was done on Isle Royale with wolves and moose through direct observations. And the inspection of kills that were located in the winter, marked on a map, that you would then visit when the snow melted and you can get in. And be mindful, Nate was kind when he said darting a wolf is confusing. It is a high-risk, stressful endeavor for them. I promise you they don't want a dart sticking in their rear end. So Nate, from all your work, how long do we keep radio collared gray wolves at Yellowstone National Park?
Well, I had sort of anticipated that I would be wrapped up by this time of the evening and I would be getting to ask you some questions. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, if we do this again in Colorado, what are the biggest 3 things that you would do differently from what happened in Yellowstone? And the one that I really want to ask you about is, do you think culling on behalf of livestock should be allowed? And just the background, part of the deal that was made when wolves were brought back to Yellowstone was that if they preyed on livestock, in order to get the ranchers on board, or as on board as they ever would be, they said any wolves preyed on livestock would be shot by government hunters, government trappers. Ordinarily illegal under the Endangered Species Act. There's a loophole. That was part of the deal that was made, and a great many wolves were shot, many of them on public land, because I'm sure people in this room are probably aware a lot of cattle and sheep are grazed on public land in the West. And those same wolves that the federal government paid to bring down from Canada and reintroduce on that federal land, another department in the federal government is inviting livestock onto that land, inviting ranchers to run livestock on that same land. Conflicts are inevitable, and when conflicts happen, a third federal agency comes in and shoots those wolves. It's like something out of Catch-22 or Dr. Strangelove or something. So that's the first thing I want to ask you. Is it time to revisit that if we do Colorado again? Or I'll make it more open-ended. What would you do if
Yeah, and I'll get to those. And so you folks know, I've also served as a state legislator for the last 11 years. I'll hold my state Senate seat through the end of 2020. So I have the good fortune to look at these issues also from a policy and legal perspective. But before we drift in that direction, because this is important to me, because Doug and I play poker, and I see Doug in a social. My wife gave me a book many years ago that said, "Friends keep you alive and healthy, not your wife, not your kids' friends." So about 2 years ago, I took to having poker games in my garage, where we drink too much good whiskey and smoke too many good cigars, and I take Doug's money. But anyway, so I want to report back. Do you guys think your wolves in Yellowstone National Park should continue to be subjected to an intensive radio calling program every year, or not? I would just a quick show of hands. Who likes the intensive research that calls for radio collars? Just a few. Who would appreciate a more thoughtful, softer approach that's based on direct observations and moving away from radio collars?
That's called a push-pull.
Well, I will report back to Doug. Bless his heart. And I will say this. He's like, as I said before, he's like a brother to me. I think the world of him, but we do disagree on some things. And I have said for years that eventually the park's research program will say to Doug, how many more? Be mindful the park, your park, is managed at least against the construct of wilderness. And consequently, heavy-handed management off of the road is typically not practiced in the park. And there's nothing but heavy-handedness involved in chasing a wolf with a helicopter and putting a darkness button. So, Nate asked me a question, and I will answer it. I have said I've been involved in this work in a very active, almost daily basis since 1980. Yes, I'm that old. Someone that I know has got a sweatshirt on from the early days, and he said, "My gosh, Mike, your hair is very different than it used to be." But I've said for many years that I think gray wolves should be managed rather conservatively on public land and rather liberally on private land. And if a gray wolf is causing a problem on private land, that problem should be redressed. Sometimes that means you've got to exercise lethal control. But there's lots of things that we can do to resolve a problem. That doesn't mean you have to necessarily kill the wolf. And then I would say on public land, and this doesn't go over with the ranching community, but it's just the way I view things, because it's public grass. And y'all know that we're heavily subsidizing the livestock industry to use that public grass. We don't really charge them what that public grass is worth. It's about an order of magnitude more valuable than we actually charge. I have always thought that gray wolves should be managed in a very conservative fashion on public land. I can make the case, short of threatening human life, there's not much a gray wolf could do wrong on public land. So that was. But I wanted to ask Nate to go into also. So y'all would never have known how 06 died if she hadn't been radio collared. If nothing else changed, she would have been shot, dead in the snow, and nobody would have, Rick would have simply said, "No, I don't know where she is. She hadn't shown up for 2 weeks," and that would have been the end of the story. But another thing happened that's fascinating that allowed for her to be lawfully killed. So be mindful, she wasn't poached. Her great-grandfather was poached. She was not. It was a lawful hunt. And walk us through what the United States Congress did, because it's your Congress doing some very interesting things. And I'm most culpable because I was the science voice behind Senator Tester's movement in the United States Senate to bring about delisting, which in the parlance of the Endangered Species Act, if a species has been delisted, the feds are no longer involved in management. It falls to the states. Wyoming was managing 06 at the time, and all the other wolves in the state. And they said, "Oh, no. We think a recreational killing program is okay." So, with that as a setup, Nate, walk them through how we...
Okay. That's the other story that's told in the book. There's sort of two parallel narratives. One of them is the life of 06, explaining how she became as celebrated as she was. But the other one tells this story that Mike just described, this kind of fight in the courts and in Congress over how wolves should be managed. Because, as Mike said, the reintroduction program was so successful that wolves spread, as was designed, throughout much of their range in the Northern Rockies, the former range. And so the question became, are they numerous enough, is the population stable enough to take them off the endangered species list and begin hunting and trapping them again? And again, this was part of the original deal that was hatched with the states. The federal government said, if you will allow us to bring them back, eventually we will turn control over to you, management over to the states, as they do every other kind of wildlife. And everybody knew at the time that would mean hunting and trapping. Of course, the devil was in the details. And one of the details in that original plan was they set an extremely modest recovery goal. Only 150 wolves in each of those 3 states in order to reach the bar that they had identified as recovery. Now today there are 1,700 wolves, at least in those 3 states. And what that means is, under state management, 2/3 of all those wolves could be killed by hunters or trappers without the federal government stepping back in. It would be perfectly legal, in other words, for the states to do that. But to get back to this scenario that Mike described, things were sort of coming to a head in the 2008-2009 period. Wolves had been taken off the endangered species list, and then a lawsuit by Earth Justice put them back on. Earth Justice used to be a branch of the Sierra Club. Does a lot of the suing, a lot of the great legal work that you've probably heard about, logging and a million other issues. And when they were put back on the endangered species list, it hit the fan in Montana. People were like, the federal government has broke their promise. It became this states' rights versus federal government dynamic that's so common now in Western politics. You see it all the time. And so what happened was, Obama had been elected in 2008. This is going to be a very brief history lesson. The Tea Party movement came to power in 2010. They lost the House. Democrats lost the House. They immediately began setting about trying to figure out how they were going to protect the Senate majority in 2012. It was a very narrow Democratic majority. One of the seats they absolutely had to have was John Tester, the Democratic senator from Montana, who had just won by the slimmest of margins, and he was up for re-election in 2012. Harry Reid, the majority leader, called him and said, "What do you need besides a ton of cash in order to beat this Republican congressman who's going to run against you?" And Tester said, "I am getting hammered on the wolf issue," which was completely unfair because he was where Montanans were on the wolf issue. He was for hunting, he was for culling on behalf of livestock, but it didn't matter. This congressman was tarring him as being associated with the federal government, the Democrats, the reintroduction, all of that. And he said, if we're going to hold on to the Senate, if Obama's agenda is going to live to see the end of his term, if Obamacare is going to live beyond its infancy, I have to be able to take the wolf issue off the plate. In other words, wolves need to start dying, not to be glib or blunt, but wolves need to start dying in Montana in large numbers and very soon. Now, Harry Reid knew that an up and down vote on taking wolves off the endangered species list again, basically overruling this federal judge in Montana, would never fly with the Democratic majority. So they attached a rider to a must-pass budget bill with very little debate. It was 1 paragraph long. It said this ruling that has been litigated for a very long time in the federal courts in Montana is invalid and not subject to judicial review, and wolves are immediately taken back off the endangered species list, and it passed just like that. And a few months later, we had another hunt. I promised that would be the short version. Trust me, that is the short version. But that's the incident that Mike is alluding to.
So, just by a show of hands, in effect, your United States Senate delisted the gray wolf by fiat, attached the delisting package to a budget bill, a rider, and then they said, we're going to shield it from judicial review so no American can seek redress in court. And of course, maybe we're too litigious, but nonetheless, it's a long-standing American right that we get to seek redress in court. And this was all done, so John was reelected. Was it the right thing to do? A show of hands, yes, right thing to do. Apparently, and then a show of hands, not the right thing to do. Okay, let's back up. A show of hands, the right thing to do. Show of hands, the wrong thing to do. Fair enough. It was, John and I walked down the parade in Bozeman, a homecoming parade, and he asked me, and I said, "John, it is a slippery slope when the United States Senate begins to micromanage the Endangered Species Act. But biologically, at the time, let's say there were 1,200 gray wolves hard on the ground, biologically the species was recovered in every manner that comported with the spirit and intent of the Endangered Species Act. It is nonetheless, John, a slippery slope to step onto by doing this. And as Nate accurately reports, I suggested he go forward, and that's exactly what Senator Tester did. I, for one, am a believer that the Affordable Care Act matters in healthcare insurance. Moreover, and this is an important point because it's going to fall to you in Colorado, and I'm going to keep looping this back to Colorado. Nate asked me, what should we do about livestock in Colorado if gray wolves are ever here in numbers? It's your decision. If Wyoming residents did not want gray wolves to be hunted, they've got to show up and say no to their commission. There's a big, frustrating conversation in Montana now about hunting grizzly bears because they've been delisted in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I say to my neighbors, as their senator, if you don't want them hunted, you need to show the hell up when the Game Commission meets and tell them no. If enough people say no, I promise you know what the commissioner's going to do? They're going to say no. How many here know David Brower? David Brower, one of the great early conservationists, right? David was a friend, and David opined years, he's dead now, but nonetheless. He said, politicians are like weather vanes, and our job is to make the wind blow. So if y'all want gray wolves in this state in a certain way, you need to make the wind blow. Now I want to ask Nate another question. This is important, and if I get my notes right, it has to do with the arrogance of watchers. The arrogance of the wolf watching community. The arrogance that we all have, that somehow our human perspective matters above all else. And I'm going to read just a few words, not from Nate's book, but from an article about his book that appeared in Outside Magazine. A reputable, right? So this journalist is writing about the notion that gray wolves with collars are being targeted and specifically killed to sort of stick it to the watching community and stick it to the research community by killing these animals that were wearing radar collars. That's the backdrop. And when I get through these words, I'm going to ask Nate a simple question that should resonate as a story time. So here, I think it was in this case is 06. I think it was absolutely targeted, Peake says. I think they targeted the collared wolves, and I think they targeted the 06 female. Sometimes I feel badly because I think her fame maybe contributed to her death. But her story brought way more people into the story of wolves and why they need to be protected. Because we told her story, her life was not in vain. I question you, can a story matter if it's not told? I think it's arrogant for them to suggest that. Her life didn't matter if they didn't tell it.
Well, I think it depends what you mean by matter, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, obviously it mattered to her, and it mattered to her pups, and it mattered to the wolves that she mated with, and but I think probably what that person was alluding to is this question of whether or not her death in some way caused a reevaluation of this public policy decision to hunt wolves. I think that's what he's alluding to there. And I think the answer to that is yes, it did. There was an enormous backlash against her death. It was in the New York Times the next day, and then it was around the world. And then shortly thereafter, a judge put wolves back on the endangered species list in Wyoming, where they stayed for several years. Again, reigniting the controversy. And then not too long after that, we had this vote. There was a move afoot to delist wolves in the rest of the lower 48. Sort of a preemptive move against what guys like Mike want to do, bring wolves to the Southern Rockies. The idea was remove them from the endangered species list now, and we'll have more management options, i.e. we'll be able to shoot them on behalf of livestock. And that went down in flames, that idea that we should delist in the rest of the lower 48. And then they went back on the list in Michigan and the upper Midwest, too. I'm not saying all these things happened because 06 was shot and because of the backlash against it, but chronologically it did happen in that order, and I think it did raise awareness about the issue. I really do. And by the way, 06 was not targeted. I interviewed the man who shot her. I found him, and he agreed to talk as long as his real name was not used. And he did not know that he had the world's most famous wild animal in his sights that day. And he didn't even see the research color, and I think Mike vouched during the winter. From 200, 300 yards, it's hard to see those colors. They're being flagged by someone in the back.
Yeah,
A time-related issue, I think.
It is.
Yeah.
We do need to move on to either the book signing and possibly a few questions if there are any.
Okay.
Okay, now wait a minute. I have a bunch of really good questions.
This is all my fault. Or the yellow cab.
Now wait a minute. Okay, so I want to ask one more question, right? Or at least one more, because it speaks again to the challenge that we have to see beyond our own sensibilities. And until we begin to see Mother Earth in more complete terms, we're going to continue to struggle with our relationship with her. So when you look at page 1, bear with me, I just had it. Where did it go? It speaks to kindness.
Page what?
Hang on. This is important.
This is
Page
like Sunday
162. And this matters. It was the death of Wolf Nose 147. My kids helped Doug carry it out of the woods, so it's important to me. But on page 162, Nate makes reference to 147 was seen in a special way because this wolf had been kind, and he used the word kind, with the old silver alpha. Hold that thought. Behind me are several books that challenge us, one by Carl Savina, a beautiful writer as well, to think about the world in terms bigger than our own. So I want to ask Nate, do you think wolves can be kind? Can they love? Can they hate? Can they have a range of emotions that celebrate all aspects of life?
Anybody who's an advocate for wolves is pushing against this boulder, or this cultural boulder that has been around since the beginning of recorded time, in which wolves have been portrayed as mindless killers. A lot has been done to undermine that myth, going as far back as Adolph Murray's first book, or Wolves and Men, Barry Lopez. So much great work has been done showing that wolves are so much more than that. As far as whether or not they have a personality, I mean, who here has had more than one dog in their life? Did they both have the same personality? No. Enough said. I think that's a wonderful question, and I think what you said was very eloquent and well said, that there is a lot. There's a lot there to be learned, and there's a lot there that you can learn